I suppose when I looked through the list of questions framing the conference, the one that particularly stood out asked what conditions contribute to meaningful participation. So as a means to responding to that, I'm going to introduce you to a project that I've worked with, Rialto Youth Project, who are a community-based youth project in Dublin, and I've worked with them for the last 8 years. First, just to give you a context, which I'm sure maybe is familiar to lots of people in this country, but the political climate in Ireland is highly antagonistic towards young people, with increasingly tense relationships between young people and the state. The justice system, police, education system and media continue to oppress young people already marginalised, creating regular flashpoints, and specifically working class young people find themselves under constant scrutiny and observation at the hands of the police, within a model of policing that just wouldn't be accepted in a middle class suburb and probably lead to a civil crisis. So living in this reality, I suppose young people find themselves having little access to public space and few opportunities to communicate their point of view in a way that they're heard. Rialto is located in the south inner city of Dublin. Traditionally working class, the landscape since the 1950s has been dominated by two large flat complexes, Fatima Mansions and Dolphin House. And it's gone through a massive change over the last number of years, and not to get too much into that, but gentrification, multiculturalism, regeneration of social housing have all contributed to a shift. And the recent economic downturn has had an effect in terms of some of the progress. The Rialto Youth Project is located centrally in that locality and has been in existence for 30 years. Their remit is to work with young people most at risk in the area, and they practice a style of youth work which is based on voluntary participation. So it's different from services where young people are paid to go or referred to go. Having worked closely with the organisation for 8 years, I suppose I've come to really recognise the value of their particular ethos, and I don't find them the norm in terms of the other youth services that I've worked with. I think they're very distinct, and I suppose that's what kept me there for 8 years. They're probably look specifically their approach to artists, and they have a long history of working in different ways with artists and arts organisations, and their rigour and their kind of criticality around their work is quite refreshing. So I would have started there in 2004 in a studio that's part of the community centre in which the Youth Project inhabit, and the idea is a studio residency, and that was 8 months, and that was 8 years ago. So the relationships that were born out of that have been sustained. The arriving, I suppose, in a context like Rialto, with the experience of the Youth Project and the specifics of the social area and my own interests as an artist, all combined led to the kind of conditions for meaningful exchange of learning and joint learning, I suppose, as we were both on a journey together. And over time, I suppose, I've found a way of positioning my practice as an artist in and around the day-to-day practice of a youth project, and that's been really difficult. And as I sweep through a cohesive narrative, that may not become obvious, but just that hasn't been an easy ride. So the specific project I'd like to talk about today happened after 4 years, and has happened for the last 4 years. Having worked on a series of projects with different groups, I suppose I'd built strong relationships, and I'd listen to young people come up the stairs into the Youth Project every day with their various different experiences. And I suppose after an initial research phase 4 years ago to think about a new project, we got involved in a gathering of stories, and I say we, at that time it was myself and a team of youth workers. And after really looking at the content of some of those stories, I felt a need to reorientate my practice towards the question of power, and to look at some of young people's experiences with the lens of power. So the phase of work began by forming a collective, and we were consciously, I suppose, trying to shift, maybe push the boundaries of collaborative practice as we knew it. So the collective was made up of youth workers, young people and myself as an artist, and the idea was to attempt to operate on horizontal relationships and see could we co-author and co-develop a practice together. The ambition from the outset was to really look at power on two levels, both within the lived experience of each of us, but also as a collective, taking into account our own differences in terms of class and privilege and access and funding and everything got put on the table. And those kind of conversations were only able to happen because of the previous 4 years relationship. It's not like we were suddenly able to talk about how much we earn and how much you don't get paid and all without having had that history. So that led to a kind of interesting level of debate. So after 4 years of that, you can understand that it's not assumed that I would be the one that would represent the project publicly, and at various different moments, different people from the collective present the work to different constituencies, sometimes all of us and sometimes individuals. So really, I suppose, to get into the project, there's multiple layers to this work, and I don't obviously have time to present it all here, so I've picked a particular strand to get to the question of learning. So one key feature of my work with the Reality Project is its duration. The relationships grew over 4 years, put me in a particular position to be able to gather stories from young people about their personal experience of power and powerlessness. And the Youth Project would have a high emphasis on trust between staff and young people, helped by the kind of generational relationship to local families and other organisations. So the negotiation of my role as story gatherer was kind of legible to young people in the context of the Youth Project and the relationships of trust. But even despite that, the gathering of the stories was extremely difficult and took a huge amount of time. So over the course of a number of months, approximately 60 stories were gathered anonymously from young people, audio recorded and transcribed. And I suppose, as with art projects of this nature, the work was evolving step by step, so it wasn't clear when we recorded those stories what they would be used for. And in that sense, it differs from formal research, where the stories would be known what they might be for, and it would be considered sort of static data. With this project, the stories were gathered, but regularly edited by the people who told them. They transformed, they changed, they're taken away, added to. So they've become kind of a living part of the project. So in November 2008, we had our first semi-public engagement, and that's after a year and a half at that point of kind of quiet work based in the Youth Project. Anonymous reading narrative and memory was the first event, and it was held in Rialto, and it took the form of an intimate reading event with an invited audience of 60 people. So from the outset, we were acknowledging the cross-sectoral relationships of the work, and for that first event, we had our own peers, so 20 young people, 20 members of people from the arts sector, and 20 youth and community workers and sociologists and that kind of sector. And everybody present participated in a choreographed journey of individual and group readings. So the idea for the form of this event emerged directly from a weekly session between members of the collective, where I had brought back the pile of anonymous stories that they themselves had told, as had we, as had a lot of other people in the area. And we had to negotiate how we would even read them to each other, seeing as they were anonymous. Everybody knowing that they had contributed meant everybody felt they had something at stake, but the tension around how that would happen led to an agreement around reading them aloud, one after the other, to each other, and that, I suppose, dictated a form that was quite interesting. It was probably the most serious moment I've ever had with a group of young people, and I suppose just the negotiation that came with that, but what was revealed in the reading aloud of another story was the respect that the young people gave to another story where they didn't give to their own, and the tension knowing you were reading the story of someone who's present in the room, and all those kind of things were starting to become a usable kind of form that we could then translate into the public domain. So that led to this first event. And the idea for this first event was to have quite a safe audience who were taking it very slowly. These were what we would call, I suppose, a trusted audience. So I'll just show you a short clip, a 3-minute clip from this event.
Anytime I see a garden, I know I'm not going to win, whatever happens. There was a time when I was outside my house, and when I was meeting a girl and I was sitting in the car and they accused me of being one of the lads who was seen somewhere earlier. They said, "You were seen down at Awful House earlier." And I said, "I've been here all night." but they always maintain that they've seen me in other places. They have something against me. They seem to think I'm this person and that person. They're judging me for who I am. Makes me so angry. Why are they picking on me? I know if I rang up the guard station, just laugh at my complaints. What's a quickly they going to do? I know I have the power to say something, but when I go near a guard station, I feel powerless to say anything. I wouldn't mind if I was in the wrong and doing the things, but I'm not. I'm walking places. I'm going to a shop. They stop me. I'm going to get a DVD. They stop me. I'm going home. They stop me. I'm going to my mates. They stop me. I can't win them. They know the amount of times they stop me that they are pissing me off. They're waiting for me to do one thing they want me to do so they can bring me down to the guard station.
When I was getting kicked out of school, I had no power. They wouldn't listen. They just went behind me back and said, "You have to go to this other school," and I didn't want to say it. They went behind me back. They organised meetings, and within a few weeks, they were like, "Right, you're going to this other school." I had no power. I couldn't do anything. I just had to go. They did it because I was in class with another minister, so the tree was clipped. It felt horrible because there was nothing I could do. I was put in a room with 4 people who were just talking. Any time I tried to talk, I was just put down. They were saying, "You did this and that, and you mess all the time, and you have to go there, you have no control over you here." Stuff like that.
So, just to say that the audience, the participating audience were the ones who read aloud the stories, so different people were asked to contribute. And over the following year, a number of different strategies were then used to represent different aspects of the project. But the next key moment, I suppose, I'd like to draw your attention to is the decision in 2009 to focus specifically on the stories which related to the Gardaí, which the Irish Police Force. It was the dominant theme, and the stories present was young people's experience of the Gardaí. An approach was made to the Chief Superintendent of the South Dublin City District, asking for a meeting with the collective, and during that meeting we pitched to him a proposal to have a second reading event, but this time with a number of Gardaí, which ended up being 26. The event was held in the Irish Museum of Modern Art, and they have shown great support for our work over the years in a kind of an understanding around how it exists, and were supportive in the sense that they respected our view not to have any media or any audience to the event. So the event later became known as the Day in Question. It involved individual Gardaí reading aloud young people's stories, followed by a facilitated discussion with the collective. And from the outset we were acknowledging that the police have a really difficult job to do. And the communities within Whyalta really want them to do that job, but we couldn't escape the fact that the overwhelming common experience for young people was one of indignity and disrespect, and that was named in the invitation to the police to be involved. The stories took place in the streets, in the homes and in the stations, so there was a common experience. We wanted to create a space for listening, where the Gardaí involved could become more aware of the potential effect of their power. The only official model in Ireland that allows young people to engage with the police is a Garda diversion programme, where young people are targeted who are at risk of breaking the law. So we want to flip that slightly and target Gardaí. And I suppose an analysis would point to the fact that people have a freedom to speak, and that there's increased modes for people to be able to speak publicly now, but not the same consideration given to people's responsibility to listen. So we were really trying to focus in on how to create an event where young people would be listened to. So strategies used where the stories were made up of experience rather than opinion generally, and in the discussion people spoke in the personal "I feel" rather than more antagonistic "you did." So the only public we had at that event was an invited group of 14 witnesses who formed the other side of the triangle, and at the end they were invited to contribute their response, having listened also, and give another kind of analytical layer to that. So I'll maybe just show a short clip from this event. third public moment I'd like to draw your attention to happened, Third public moment happened another year later, called Policing Dialogues. It was a 6-week residency in the Lab, which is a Dublin City Council run gallery in the inner city. A major concern of mine was the transition to such a public cultural venue, where a lot of the work had been really positioned quietly in Rialto, and how it would not be read as the public manifestation of a project, but rather a moment on a much longer journey. For this residency, we had to seek a range of support in terms of facilitation, media training, an advisory group, and some sociological analysis. And we used the residency to develop a further process of inquiry, a space for much deeper learning. So the approach was twofold. There was an exhibition over 2 floors, which displayed many of the stories and video material on this triangle, which has become a symbol but also functioned as a seat for discussion. We were also confident that this was not a local issue, and so we shared our story gathering process with other youth projects from across the city and encouraged them to collect stories anonymously in the same way from other young people. And over the 6 weeks of the exhibition, 45 new stories arrived anonymously in the gallery, from youth workers, and were placed in boxes. For Rialto young people, the transition from private to public had taken many stages, and I purposely used the same clip and the same story in the 2 events just to show over the years, I suppose, what was happening to people with their stories, from having told it out loud to seeing it in print, to hearing it in a number of different forms, in film and an event, to then having it in a public space, public used carefully, and with national media coverage. And I suppose the journey over time with the stories gave a certain robustness to the collective and allowed active work to happen within the space because of people's comfort with their own story. Over the 6 weeks, there were many layers of inquiry, with youth groups, student groups, from fine art to criminology, from secondary school to PhD, public talk, seminar, and even members of the collective, I suppose, were forming into subgroups to focus on the strand of the residency that matched their own particular preoccupations. We weren't attempting to present an authentic voice, or one authentic voice, rather a multiple of narratives to try to highlight the complexity of this issue, and we weren't even attempting to answer it, but rather just to raise it and respond to it and see what would come from that. So the meaning was being created live in the space. The media also became an important arena for mediating the collective's work and the broader questions that it was raising. It was highly misrepresented, and I won't go into anecdotes, but some media really misunderstood it and misrepresented it. The art media largely ignored it, but we found one advocate, Vincent Brown, who's a leading journalist in Ireland with a particular left-wing approach, who really seemed to understand the core essence of the work and became an advocate for it, with kind of unprecedented coverage, devoting a TV programme to it. Another specific cycle of learning was happening throughout the residency. The gallery was closed for 2 days mid-exhibition for facilitated dialogue between the collective and that original group of Gardaí who participated in the Irish Museum of Modern Art, which was now over a year on from that event. This dialogue raised many issues, such as the Gardaí's misunderstanding of young people's behaviour, which led to a whole discussion around the nature of gang intimidation and how young people exist in their local area, but also in terms of what constitutes suspicion in a guard's mind when he's out policing. The guards also explained their sense of powerlessness within the force and the contributing factors to this, and their deep frustration at the experience of policing the drugs issue and their own experience within the justice system. And so I suppose both sides were getting a sense of each other's reality. To acknowledge, I suppose, that young people took an initial risk in placing their stories in this arena, but that risk was definitely matched by the Guardian who participated and were part of that debate. What the facilitator identified was what she called a stuck pattern, where both sides felt that they needed to behave the way they behaved. So in responding to that, we were trying to think, well, how do we move on from that? And all the learning and debate that came out of the sessions and the stories were then fed into a series of weekly meetings between a core group of us and some different ranking Gardaí. And these weekly meetings were focused on the co-development of 2 new training sessions for Gardaí to address what we would find as the agreed gaps in Garda training. These 2 modules were called Understanding Young People's Behaviour and Understanding Poverty and Urban Disadvantage. So rather than just create momentary opportunities for young people's voice, we were attempting to address a structure to allow young people to be heard in a different way. The attempted implementation of this agreed 2-day training has not quite happened, and largely to do with the economic downturn. The Garda budget has been completely changed and minimised, so we're still working on that. I'm still convinced it may happen, so we're getting there. And I suppose myself and the youth project are working on an exit strategy from the project as well. So we've done the work, we've learned from it, we're attempting to implement the training, and now we're seeing how we can make sure it's being attended to, but kind of move back from it. And there's currently another follow-on project which is going a little bit deeper kind of in our heads. So how am I for time? Okay, God, okay. I was going to just talk a little bit about learning, if you can give me just a couple of minutes. So, I suppose myself and the youth project are always committed to evaluation, and while they're committed to evaluation, my sense of critical reflection on what we do together to capture the learning. The youth project has gone through its own process of understanding around the arts. The collective have had to go through a process. I think we've identified that we've gone beyond traditional roles within our group, and that's a whole other space. But the potential for interdisciplinary learning within what we've done is really rich. The triangulation of youth worker artists and young people no longer seems appropriate, as young people have aged with the process and are no longer traditionally young people. They themselves have other titles that they choose to use, and that's presented a real challenge in terms of how we hold the space. So rather than the need to reproduce and constantly reproduce something, having realised the project in a particular way, we're happy to let the What's the Story Collective, which was our title, let that go. Maybe just to switch along then to my final kind of point. Later this month we're going to launch a newspaper which attempts to bring in some of that learning together, multiple voices, different perspectives, personal and analytical, and that I suppose will be some record. But I suppose if I return to the question around what conditions contribute to meaningful participation, the level of negotiation that took place is really hard to understand when I present a narrative like this. The level of support is also really hard to understand, and it was so layered and loaded in all kinds of ways throughout. But maybe the three features just that I think are particularly important for this project: the duration, ever evolving, growing from really quiet periods of years right up to public manifestations, and the slowness that took at times and how it was needed. The cross-sectoral nature of the work, drawing from a range of knowledge and multiple intentions. The fact that the work was co-authored, and the art sector I think has a real anxiety around working really cross-sector with other disciplines, so that's been quite challenging. And thirdly, the importance of evaluation being built in from the beginning and having a lens that really looks wide enough to see the very roots to the very legacy of a project. And I think most traditional evaluation processes would have stopped, say, after the public manifestation, and now we're already a year on and we're still trying to gather the learning. So I am ending. To finally conclude, when I started in Rialto 8 years ago, I suppose I had a real, and it's been referred to earlier, the real anxiety around how the art world would view me as an artist, particularly because for the first couple of years it was very quiet and hidden, and that was misread by many of my peers. But now I suppose I'm frustrated now more at that gaze from the art world in terms of the tools it uses in order to understand, and the inefficiencies, I suppose, of that gaze in reading socially engaged practice. So I suppose I'm urging for a much longer lens to be used to really look at this type of practice and to see can we really capture the real value behind it.